Welcome to webinar number 12 in our data-centric AI series at the Open Data Institute. And today we're going to talk about public services and AI. And we have a great lineup of speakers today. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to do a round of introductions in a short while, but let me first go through some housekeeping while people arrive. So we will be recording the webinar and we'll share it with you and through various channels. And we also want to reuse some of the quotes and amazing content I'm sure we will have to in future ODI communications. So there's opportunities to ask questions, there's opportunities to give feedback and also watch the recordings later. And our wonderful team in the back office at the Open Data Institute is available throughout to take your questions, but also answer any other queries you may have. So I was talking about this being webinar number 12. Which means we had other 11 webinars before. And this slide is getting very, very crowded. You don't need to read it, but there is this hopefully helpful QR code on the right-hand side where you can access all of them. Today, we're talking about reliable public services with AI. So maybe now would be a good time for our brilliant speakers to introduce themselves, and I'll start with Emer.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming along. So I'm Emer Coleman, and I'm formerly of the London Data Store and GDS. I have now moved to Portugal, where I'm joining you. And currently I'm freelance writing a column for Computer Weekly on the intersection of technology, politics, and society.
Welcome, Emer, and welcome from Portugal. I'm a bit jealous now. So I've ordered speakers alphabetically because that's what academics do. So I'll go next to Andy. Welcome, Andy.
Hey everybody, great to be here. I'm from the, I'm going to guess less sunshiny, this office is in Wales, where it is pleasingly raining and grey as one might expect. I'm the head of AI at Full Fact. We're a fact checker based in the UK. And I think about how we can use AI to support processes of fact checking, but also how good information permeates into the web to ensure that people have the information that they need when they need it most. And my background is kind of guess career technologist, but previous to Full Fact, I was a deputy director at the Office for National Statistics and was running the websites there for a number of years.
Welcome. Richard, where are you calling in from?
Morning, everyone. I'm in London, which is resembles Wales, I think it sounds like at the moment. Also grey and rainy. Morning, everyone. I'm Richard Pope. I'm an independent consultant, mostly working in public sector digital things. I published a book last year year before, it's now 2026, isn't it? On digital public services called Platform Land. Previous life, I've worked in a mix of kind of startups and also the government digital service in the early days.
Welcome. And last but not least, I'm Elena Simple. I'm the ODI's Director of Research. I also have a side gig at King's College London. So I'm an academic. I've been working in AI in a branch of AI called symbolic AI, which used to be really unfashionable and now apparently is going to solve all problems that large language models have. At King's, I also lead the King's Institute for Artificial Intelligence. Part of my role at the ODI is to drive the research strategy and work with people like Neil and others who have contributed to the work that I'm going to present in a second to advise government organizations in the public and private sector on how to do good things with data, good for them and good for the rest of us. So today we're going to do two things. First, we thought we'd take the opportunity to tell you about a project we've been working on in the past I'd say 9 months, which is very much pertaining to this question of how can one build reliable public services with this amazing technology that we all learned to embrace in the last 2.5 years. And then we're going to move on to a more open conversation with Emer and colleagues. So I was told I have 15 minutes for the slides, but I am rather chatty, as you can see. So if I go completely off topic or if I speak for too long, please interrupt me. Presentation. Okay, so what is the presentation about? So the project in question is called Citizen Query UK. And the question we're trying to ask is, can we trust generative AI with answering questions about citizen concerns? And the motivation has been driven by a change in how we look for information, including information about public services. Say, I have never been to citizen advice, but many people have or used to. And then as we became more and more digitally savvy, governments have started to put this information online, and the UK government has been a pioneer in this respect, if I may say so. So we would go to the website of our local authority or to gov.uk and search for information there. But now, as with everything, or actually, I should say, we would go to a search engine, to Google, and we'd type something, and at the top, almost certainly, we would get the links to the government websites. Now things are very different. Now we are discussing with chatbots, and we are Googling and receiving these AI overviews and related types of AI-generated summaries in return. So in this world, where we get our information about public services from AI overviews and the like, in this world where government institutions are thinking about providing chat interfaces to government portals, how reliable are these technologies? What do we mean by that? So the project is called Citizen Queries. So just to give you a sense of the types of questions that we looked at, they can be many and varied, right? So I remember listening to a presentation of GDS ages ago when I was in Southampton, and they were talking about the digital transformation in government and about new government website, and they were talking about the most popular query everyone had was, how do I renew my driving license? So anything related to cars, also at the top of our list here. Can I drive without insurance? I don't know. But then all sorts of concerns from is my employer allowed to take my tips, to public health questions, for instance, about vaccines, questions that pertain to my location, like where can I find volunteering activities near me, and many others. Yeah. So the point here is that we're looking at citizen queries as a set of information needs in technical terms that would cover a wide range of topics. They can be specific to the context of an individual, sometimes have a time dimension to them, so they can be urgent. We are really not looking for opinion or advice. We are looking for information from government guidance, and we want to have easily understandable answers. Some of these queries can also be quite sensitive from a privacy point of view. So here come chatbots. Lots of great things about them. So they have very strong general knowledge. They can talk to you in your language, so you don't need to do all this weird stuff with filters and whatnot. They're quite fast. They offer some degree of privacy, and they can personalize responses. So not just with respect to language, but also other types of circumstances, digital literacy, accessibility, and so on. And we're using them anyway. 800 million people a month use ChatGPT. However, chatbots also make things up, and they do that in a very confident way. They aren't always up to date. They can refuse to answer some questions, or at least that's what we thought, and can't always tell you where the information comes from, which is really important if you now want to act on that information. So what did we do in the project? Well, we've actually started testing. can chatbots answer a range of citizen queries that we have collected? So the way you do this from an AI sort of engineering point of view is you start building a data set and you make it as representative, as big as you can afford, time-wise, budget-wise, and as diverse and representative as you can. And then for each, that data set is made of queries, and for each query, you then has to say, this is the correct answer, or this is how the correct answer would look like. And then you start testing so-called large language models, which is the AI tech that chatbots use. And then again, there you want to take some bigger ones, some smaller ones, some more expensive ones, some cheaper ones, some open source one, and so on. And then there's a question of what you're measuring, because the LLM is going to generate, the chatbot is going to give you an answer back, but you know what your answer, your desired answer should be. So you need to think about ways to compare those. And then what you also do, if you're civilized, is that you share your data and code for everyone to use. The data itself, if anyone's interested, we will share a paper and a report and many other things in the chat. It's basically 22,000 queries, so that's decent, on a range of topics. And then those queries basically, you have to imagine them as prompts, as the type of thing that you write in a chatbot. So then you add to them personas. I am a single mom and I'm looking for this and this, yes. And then you add metadata, which is bits of techie text to make sure that the answers are written in a certain way. The data is synthetically generated with an LLM, which is not a bad thing. Yeah, so LLMs are becoming really, really good at this, and there's ways to validate their output. And the information, the answers, is entirely built on gov.uk. If anyone wants to have more details, say here's the distribution of different topics and the number of queries we have, and here's how a row in a spreadsheet, in my 22K rows spreadsheet, looks like. So I have the prompt, the query, I have the expected response, see how long it is, then I have a persona, and then a few other information, including chiefly where the information comes from. So then what did we wanted to know when we tested? We wanted to know how factual the responses are. We wanted to know if any LLM, if they don't know, would actually refuse to answer the queries. And we wanted to know just how useful the queries were, in the sense that, are they particularly verbose? Do they get to the point? Just to give you an example, so very briefly, so if I am interested in the grants that I'm eligible as an expecting parent in Scotland, which I obviously am, then there is an answer on a government website about it, but also each of the LLMs we tested, we generated one, and then we compared them. For anyone who's interested in really techie bits, this slide is for you. For anyone else who wants to get just a general understanding of what this is, so these are the measurements that we have calculated. On the left-hand side, you have the LLMs we have tested. Yeah. There's two tables. The first one is called zero-shot performance. That means we've just put the prompt in the LLM and retrieved what the answers were and then assessed them. The second one is called few shots. So we helped the LLM with some examples. And then the bits in blue that I highlighted are essentially the metrics, the technical metrics that we have used to understand how performant these LLMs are. What did we find out? I'm wrapping up. Lots of correct answers, but also a lot of variance in quality, especially for so-called long tails, so very specialized, very niche queries. Hardly ever any of these chatbots refuse to answer a question, even if the answers are wrong. The answers are really lengthy, much more verbose than what you would expect from a government website. If you try to nudge the chatbot to get to the point, it decreases performance in some cases. And also, open and small models are quite competitive. Now, what does it mean? Many, many things. But I'd say for us all as citizens, AI literacy is paramount. For everyone else, including those who are in charge of designing and procuring public services, really don't rush for the biggest, most expensive LLM available, and avoid vendor lock-in, because things are improving all the time. we need more and larger benchmarks like this. So I've mentioned public health as one example. This could be just one extension that we could see. We need different languages, so we're working on Welsh at the moment. Better independent testing of AI-enabled public services should be non-negotiable, and actually making the results public as well. And last but not least, we do need more research. We need more innovation to understand how do we tailor the behavior, the performance of these amazing technologies to give us precise answers that are useful whenever we need them. And let me just wrap up by saying that this has been a collaborative effort, and I'm just sitting here in front of you presenting the work. And the work was conducted by my colleague Neil at the ODI with advice from our co-founder Nigel Shatwold, but also in collaboration with colleagues in the US from the NASA MSFC Office for Data Science and Informatics. So huge thanks also to Rajat and Manil and their wonderful interns, Zoe, Prajun, and Jordan. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Elena. That's really interesting. But just before we get into the specifics, I just wanted to ask, you had a slide on the transition from old school Citizens Advice Bureau to AIs, and then GovUK obviously coming in between that. So GovUK was a component of the e-government movement, really, in the early 2000s. So I wanted to ask Richard, what was that kind of e-government period like? And what did it show about government and technology? And are there any similarities in terms of how it reflects the current move towards AI?
Yeah, look at that. So one of the kind of like phrases that got trotted out in the early days of gov.uk was Google as the homepage. So to some extent, gov.uk was a response to the fact that the primary information seeking tool that people had access to was suddenly a search engine. So like if gov.uk as it existed then was a response to that, I think it's right to ask the question, what's the equivalent public service response to the emergence of LLMs and related systems? Certainly, things will change. Technology is not just the thing we use to create services; it kind of exerts its own pressures.
Yeah. And Andy, with that in mind, like the government is saying a lot about, about we have the AI Opportunities Action Plan, the Blueprint for Modern Digital Governance, and more. What do you think the government's actually saying about AI? If you were to break it down, what's its position really?
I mean, it's a good question, and one that I'm going to try and answer briefly, because the government positions could take this whole session. I think broadly the government has said that it's pro-innovation. That's something that it likes to say and continually, and I think that's a decent framing, and that it sees regulation at the moment as being principles based. So the idea of where some guardrails could be based on different regulators, and it is championing the progress it's making against the AI Opportunities Plan. So that was laying out 50 things that the government wanted to do by 2027. And as recently, the government has published a sort of an update, a live tracker effectively of how it's doing against those things. And I think as of this morning, 38 of those 50 things that are being tracked as being completed. But I would say that a lot of those things are to set out or to establish or to articulate or allocate rather than necessarily the delivery of things. So they're good foundations, but we haven't got all the way through to those things yet. There are some promising things in there. The idea of setting out better data standards for how open data can be published by the government so it's easier to be consumed by AI exist in there. ODI has fed into them, I noticed, but they're also quite verbose at the moment. They lay out lots of ways that could happen. Obviously, lots of investment in infrastructure around data centers and compute and making sure that's being accessed, and growth zones and tech towns and all of these different kind of ideas. But I think the most practical, tangible things maybe have been things like the AI Security Institute, which I think is now delivering a lot of really interesting stuff. I should declare, full fact, the organization I work for receives some funding from AC. But the big ticket item really is that legislation around this is still being formed. Maybe this year we'll start to see something, and that I'm assuming is going to be fairly broad touch of regulation at the very edges of things. And I suppose effectively the UK is maybe adopting AI faster than it's learning how to use it, would be the headline I would give. And is racing to deploy things, but how would I put it? Ambling towards understanding accountability. And I think that's what today, and that's why this stuff is so interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And Elena, in the context of your research and your colleagues' research, how do you think the alignment is there in terms of whether the government itself should be making models, or should they be a provider for them with regards to data and benchmarking? I mean, where's the kind of balance?
Yeah, thank you for this. I suppose it's great to see progress towards setting up the framework conditions to create those AI opportunities, and certainly investment in infrastructure is a good thing, considering there's serious considerations about how that investment will be sustained in the long term. At the same time, we have seen much less focus on useful AI. So we've seen we talk a lot about innovation. We talk about UK making AI. The UK is not making AI. If we're talking about foundational models, most of them come from abroad. If we're talking about open source or open weights models, foundational models, so those that can be customized much more easily than, say, an OpenAI model where you have to access it via an API and can't really change so much how it works for you. Those models come from China. So when we talk about making AI, we're talking about making useful AI applications, and the opportunities plan, I think, should seriously consider in the next iteration what that actually means, maybe also in relation to the industrial strategy, because we have a number of sectors that are priorities for the government. And actually those businesses, including disruptors in those sectors, are adopting AI. But say regarding the government being a provider of data, I think yes, as Andy also mentioned, there's been some work recently from DCIT about this. There's the whole conversation about the National Data Library and how that could boost AI. I think it needs to go much further than that. I mean, if we're thinking about other public services, if we talk about health data, or if we're talking about organizations sharing data with government or businesses sharing data as well, more needs to be done to make sure that data sharing for AI purposes is beneficial to mutually beneficial for everyone involved. And the other thing I would say with benchmarks, I love the work of the AI Security Institute. I think it's amazing, but I would love for them to invest more in these use case specific benchmarks that really show that something is delivering to a specific need that people have. As an AI scientist, I do appreciate there is a huge area of work that needs to be done to understand the algorithmic side and the foundations of this work. But for me, 2026 is going to be make or break. Either, putting all the stock market discussions aside, either we see productivity improvements or something will change.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thanks for that. I totally agree with that. I mean, all of the reports so far seem to be looking at, very negligible productivity gain in actual terms, which runs completely counter to the level of investment that's being made, not to mind. Let's not even go into the environmental debacle that's unfolding as a result of all of this. Andy, I wanted to go back to you for a moment around trustworthiness in AI, because obviously the OpenGov corpus provides a measurement of trustworthiness in AI models when it comes to things like citizens' queries. But, what does trustworthiness actually mean? And do benchmarks actually indicate trustworthiness?
I mean, this is something as a technologist and a fact checker I think about all of the time. So one of my absolute favorite conversations. I think benchmarks are a really interesting thing in the way that they use with AI, because they often have this idea of being quite esoteric. So the idea of a brand new model is going to be performing really well against benchmarks like humanities last exam, this kind of like quite clever, we're going to try and catch you out kind of thing, which is interesting, but sometimes feels to me more like showing off than actually helping people understand whether they can trust AI. And even some of the things that sit underneath it, there's a well-known thing called the simple Q&A benchmark, and that one of the questions in there is who has the Guinness record for making the largest Nerf gun? And it's like, again, it just feels a little bit tricksy. And this is why I like this work. I feel it's so compelling because it's thinking about trustworthiness from the point of view of the person who is using these tools rather than somebody who is trying to sell these tools. And that to me feels really, really important. And I would like to see more focus, I think, on the idea of consumer facing trustworthy stuff, public facing trustworthy stuff. This being about the idea of how models interface with government information, but I think we can take that to a wider world. Certainly one of the things we're interested in our work, particularly also doing some work around benchmarking, is things like election integrity, about what happens when you ask chatbots, who should I vote for? Who can I vote for? Where is my polling station? Those kind of things are really, really important. And I think this is an area where there's more investment needed. And I'm particularly interested in, I suppose, the ideas of drift. So how do these things perform over time? Because we see that quite a lot where you do get a different set of answers at different times. How temporal some of these things are in terms of this odd conflation of a large language model and web search sort of mushed together when the public are trying to consume this information. Obviously, how correct are they feels really important in this. And I feel like there's much more conversations need to be had around just making sure that we are able to articulate that large language models, which are things that people are increasingly starting to trust, aren't necessarily a neutral concept. In the same way that a newspaper may have a political bias, we need to engage with the fact that large language models inherently might, depending on the training, about the rules and the sat around them, and that we need to ensure that we're talking about that as well when it comes to trust.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, particularly with government. I mean, as a former, communications director in government, I mean, it's a nightmare for me to think people would have thought I just made stuff up. The LLM just hallucinates something. Well, as director of comms, I couldn't have just hallucinated an answer. It's about integrity and trust and truth. So very challenging times for government. You know what I mean? And I think what you're saying is great. Richard, looking at that in terms of the ecosystem that's evolving, for answering things like citizens' queries, we understand, for example, Anthropic are now going to work on something that's offering career advice, for example. So does it mean government should build those models themselves, or that they should involve things like ChatGPT if that were to prove, or would it be wise for government just to solely invest in building their own AI models?
So I mean, I'm at risk of sounding contrary, but I think there's probably a good thing. I'm very skeptical of the people who are like super AI boosterish, and therefore that gives them the ability to kind of dismiss any kind of criticism. I think we do see a bit of that, particularly from like kind of this policy class who are maybe kind of really excited about it, but it makes it easy for them to diss. I mean, I think there are real amazing possibilities of how we use this technology to deliver public services. So whether it's like disease imaging or helping someone understand their next steps when they're in a really complicated set of circumstances, or translating things, or improving a face-to-face appointment so that people can, like public servants, can be more present with the people they're supporting. Like real opportunities in helping public sector organisations deliver their core function. But at the same time, we need to be thinking about, it's kind of, I wrote down two questions. Obviously, there's more, but there's what's the political economy of these systems? And you've written loads about this in your Computer Weekly email. It's kind of one, and then I'll come on to it in a minute, is how should we be thinking about designing these systems? So I think on the first one, I came across a quote in a Chatham House blog post the other day around, it was about Gaullism and sovereignty, but it said not all dependencies are strategically significant. The challenge is finding the ones that the difference between tolerable independence and things that are actually a vulnerability. And we've got a few of these in this space. So where are the things where actually, it's going to be a bit messy and we're going to be reliant on commercial systems that, like Andy said, may well have a political bias. But where do those become genuine vulnerabilities? And the trouble is these things probably become harder to spot because, like Andy just said, they drift, which is why the sort of tools that Anna was talking about become really important, because we need to understand these things not just as a point in time, but kind of on an ongoing basis. We also need to be really careful. We talk, trust is obviously a multifaceted thing, but there's the trust, is this thing being honest with me? But also, is the system that underlies a public service running counter to the values of that public service? we've seen this in kind of the NHS with like data in the past, where people think data is being used for commercial drug development versus delivering a service, and that like people don't like it because it feels like they're putting in opposite directions. When it comes to designing, this kind of does talk a bit more to the point of like build versus kind of like the government version versus the commercial ones. I think we need to think of AI as a material to design into public services. So there's loads of kind of like business cases for government and examples in the commercial sector as well, actually, of like AI products. Everybody's got a little button with a magic wand on it. Like actually, we're going to see like a bit like in the early days of the web, where every company was setting up this kind of like wacky side thing, which was its web, before they realized that actually it's how you deliver your services. We need to think about like designing these things into services. I think Apple, like government, should probably be following the Apple approach here, which is like make it as boring as possible. It's like little bits within the design of a service, and then that relates back to the kind of political economy point. Actually, like if government owns the interface and it really uses it very sparingly where it knows it works, then actually that means it can keep the commercial players a bit at arm's length. It's kind of there's a play that Apple's making, right, with its approach to AI. And I think probably government wants to copy that, be a bit cautious, make sure it still owns a relationship, have the ability to swap models in and out, and make it boring. That's the challenge.
Yeah, because it's all the learning as well. I mean, going back to even London, data store days or Transport for London. When Transport for London did eventually give a concession, for example, for Wi-Fi, I remember having a discussion with them at the time saying, whatever you do, don't lose control of the data, right? 5 years later, I get a call from their commercial director saying, we don't have any of the data. I'm like, what do you mean? So like, you just have to be so careful with these things, I think, at a government level, that you are retaining the amount of control and using the amount that it's effective, but also gives you that sovereignty. I mean, Elena, how do you envisage the relationship between government and industry at this kind of political and technical level? What's your view?
I think, Richard already mentioned many good things I would agree with. I think and he is gone now. I shouldn't have called him out. So maybe one thing that hasn't been mentioned before, which is again in this category of boring technical plumbing, is the role of standards. So vendor lock-in is one thing. Literally, for someone like myself or Andy who work in this space, there's a new, really good, exciting model being released every week. Yeah, so it's progress. I mean, you could argue whether it's measured in the right way or whether it's slowing down or accelerating, but we are making progress and the field is changing really, really quickly. So any type of vendor lock-in or model lock-in would be premature, if not ill-advised, in more general terms. So what do I mean by standards? So this is very early days for AI apps or services development. I think, Richard, you mentioned the web. I would just mention office tools. Yeah, product. We are in a stage where you cannot take the data from one AI tool, one machine learning tool that engineers use, and just use it somewhere else. We are certainly not in a time when you can download all your chats from one chatbot and put them in the next chatbot. And there's many examples like this. Some of you may have heard about agents, say autonomous programs that you can program to do certain things for yourself, like to book an appointment somewhere, or make a payment or order something. Yeah. So in those cases, you have your chatbots, AI chatbots, interacting with an existing website that, for instance, sells something, with a government service to upload some documents and check them. The question of interoperability, so how all these platform systems work together, the question of data portability, how do I take my data and put it into a similar service, is not solved. There's conversations that are happening among engineers and some specialized standardization bodies, but this is becoming so important that there has to be a bigger national conversation and international collaboration to sort this out, because we are not in a situation anymore like we were in the 90s with the web, where everything was publicly available. We're in a situation where there are silos everywhere. So standards would be actually the bit that I would say will matter as well, in the way in which we, the UK, is going to shape that conversation.
Yeah. Thanks, Elena. Just going back to OpenGov Corpus, there's a little carve out in the methodology for abstention when you're measuring when LLMs don't want to answer a question. So Andy, I wanted to go back to you again with like, how do you feel that, how does abstention interact with trust? So is it good if an AI model says, I don't know? I mean, particularly if that's the government saying, I don't know. And how does that line up with the incentives of big tech model developers like OpenAI, who clearly don't want to say, I don't know?
Yeah, it's such an important area. I think, so I work as in a fact-checking organization, and one of the most powerful things I think we can do sometimes is to say that we don't know. So when we're trying to verify a piece of information, particularly if it's something there's a lot of public debate about, if we say we don't know, there's simply not enough information to be able to substantiate that. That is a really legitimate thing to be able to do. People often want us to say yes, no, black, white. It's not, the world doesn't look like that. And so I think from a information point of view, saying I don't know is an incredibly powerful choice. And I think for models, it's also an important thing as well. And I guess this is where we need to differentiate between the training of underlying models and the sort of the Gen AI stuff that sits around it. Because I would suspect if you had unfiltered access to any of the large language models and asked it how to rob a bank, it would give you a pretty decent stat for giving an answer. But that's an illegal activity. Rightly, they say we're not going to give you the answer to that. They're perfectly capable of putting in those restrictions around these things. There is a collection of rules, which could be small models, it could be other kind of trust and safety things that sit around the edges of them. And working out what is the right point to bring those things in is, I think, a conversation that comes back to maybe a concept like harm, of how harmful could this information be if it is incorrect, because generative models are doing just that. They are generating information based on what has gone into them previously. And so there's an element of what is the action that somebody could take basis on this information. And potentially, I suppose there's always a risk of hallucinations. We must factor that in. But the risk is not so much the hallucinations, it's how trusting humans are. And so we're quite used to the idea that when we search for things on the internet, we get quite good information. And working out what that looks like at the moment, where stuff looks very plausible, very persuasive, might not be true. I would suggest maybe that as an industry, as platforms, and maybe around things like the Online Safety Act, we need to be thinking more about the idea of harmful content and treading back a little bit and thinking about, you don't have to answer everything. And at times it's actually quite sensible and helpful to say, I don't know the answer for that, or that is something for you to go and research, because that is around your identity and that's something that a model is not going to understand.
Yeah. Just to talk about other kinds of AI, for example, not just those that would be used for citizen queries. So I'm asking this Richard first, and then Elena, if you can come in after Richard. So a lot of AI in government won't be user-facing necessarily. So it could be machine learning models developed for monitoring or analyzing or forecasting things like environmental or economic data. How do those kind of deployments get built, and how are they measured for performance and trustworthiness? So Richard, maybe if you could go first.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've read about this in the past. That government, a lot of government activity is about putting very boring facts on the public record. So the fact a company exists, or the planning application happens, or something becomes insolvent, like those things are put on the public record for the public good. When it comes to technology, which actually, like, digital systems change all the time, and they change based on like a very complex set of variables. We don't have a good public record of how systems change, how they work, and how they're changing, and we need to invest in that. It needs to become a part of every technology business case. Like, how are you going to make sure that how this thing works over time is validated? Some of that sits in the like civic space, but some of it needs to sit in the government space as well. that needs taking seriously. It needs investment. I think it's interesting to think about positioning. So like if you think about like the relationship between a citizen and a public service or a public servant, where you position like automated and AI systems around that becomes like it changes. So if you think about someone going to visit a doctor, now you could position an AI system post fact afterwards, completely hidden from that interaction because it's summarizing some notes, for example. That's very different to having something that is someone's dealing with as an intermediary, and that's very different to having something that kind of like sits alongside. We need to understand those different qualities, and actually, I think probably the latter of those feels like the place that I personally think deserves most attention is like how do we use these systems not to replace relationships, but actually to improve them, to augment them. It's really hard for government though, which tends to be unspoken thing about a lot of the excitement again in the sort of policy world of AI is like it infers pound signs, like, oh, we can do this stuff cheaper. And it's like, yeah, maybe you can, or maybe you can do it better, like in fundamentally new ways. It also happens to be cheaper, but like if your starting point is cheaper, you might not work out. So yeah, I think positioning is really important.
Thanks, Richard. Elena?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to these different types of systems, in terms of risks, probably the former category that Richard mentioned is less problematic to deal with, and also less problematic to roll out if people don't have civil servants or medics or me at the university don't have the feeling that this is being done because eventually they want to replace us all with robots. Whereas if you're thinking now about a chatbot that would allow someone to book an appointment to with their GP, that's a very different context, and then you'd need to test, then you'd need to think about trust in a different way. But in all those cases, all of us will have to be better at understanding what these technologies are good for and what these technologies are not good for. And when they make mistakes, and chiefly also be able to use them when they make mistakes in a reliable way. Because that's where that trusted interaction with technology happens. And we're not there yet. We need to invest much more in that type of literacy. We also need to invest in, we also need to understand that in a world where information is generated very, very quickly at scale without a lot of effort, it's less about searching for the right information on time, but it's more about being able to audit large amounts of, worst case slop, best case well-meant, comprehensive responses to not just spot mistakes, but also find the bit of information that we're looking for.
Great, thanks, Elena. We're getting some interesting questions in, guys. So I think it might be good to just open it up to you guys on the panel. One person's asking, who's being consulted on AI implementation in government? Is it being led by technical people, or are we consulting experts like librarians who are specialized in the domain of knowledge management? Are we risking not getting the full picture by not going beyond the maths and tech? Andy, do you want to take that from a human perspective? You're not all human, guys.
Yeah, I think this is the kind of thing where it's an everybody thing, right? In terms of the way that decisions are being made at the moment, we can see the scale of AI content production is increasing, but also that scaling the kind of confusion that comes with that. And so there are a lot of voices that need to be heard in this, and I think it's going to be choices that need to be made on implementation levels. So government will be doing good work. I am not across the detail of that, but DCAI do appear to be trying to lead on this and make sure that people are understood. But some of the things that come from AI are another layer on top of societal problems or things that have existed for a long time. And we should not be making the assumption that AI is a magic route through those things where you need multidisciplinary teams or you need to make sure you have the genuine user feedback, because those things don't go away, even if you have an accelerant of a particularly maybe generational technology applied to them as well.
Great. Elena, do you want to
Yeah,
add?
so I was just reflecting on some of the work that is happening in the Department for Education. I'm not very close to that project, but know a little bit about it to comment. So there's been investment, for instance, in understanding how data sharing and stewardship for AI use cases could look like. So think about coursework essays by students and how those could be shared with e-learning companies to, for instance, provide services like personalized feedback to students. So I was particularly impressed there by the work that was done, I think in collaboration with Connected by Data, where they have very thoughtfully engaged with students, with parents, with different stakeholders to get an understanding of what are the useful AI use cases, what are really the pain points that AI could solve, what are the issues that have been there, like Andy was saying, for a long time. So AI is not going to cut red tape. AI is not going to deal with the fact that your teachers are overworked, and many things like that. But I would say, yeah, a very good example of how that can happen. It takes time, and it takes resources, but it can lead to better trust, and it also can lead to sometimes people need to find the right way to cut through the hype. And actually, when this type of broad engagement happens, you do identify the small, perhaps boring, as we were talking earlier, problems that you can reliably solve.
Thanks, Elena. Apologies, my Wi-Fi is a bit unstable, so if I'm dropping in and out there, apologies. One of the questions again for the panel is around transparency. You know, how do we ensure transparency? Do we regulate it, or do we measure it ourselves?
I mean, I can comment a little bit, but I don't want to dominate the conversation. So I think from a technical point of view, it is not easy, but it is also not as hard as some of the companies will make you believe. Say there's also questions for us, and we're doing some research in a different project at the ODI around trying to understand what's meaningful transparency. So what would someone say, user of ChatGPT, want to know about this at all? And we don't know that. So very often you talk about transparency registers and other types of sort of one size fits all type of information, or you talk about so in the European Union is designed these transparency templates with mandatory reporting and so on. All fine. But it's unclear really whether that type of information would lead to better performance or more responsible practices, or in fact people thinking that the performance of these tools that they're using has improved.
Thanks, Lena. Richard, do you want to make any comment about that?
Yeah,
transparency.
Sorry. Yeah, and a bit on to tie back to the previous question as well. Actually, I think there's the uses of these things in public services is like it's new, it's emerging. We don't really know what works. Some of it will surprise us, some of it won't. Therefore, like the obligation on like how you set up this work in the public sector is to start small and grow, and learn and work in the open. That runs counter to a lot of the kind of like the push from industry, I think, which is like, oh, just let us do a pilot and then you can scale it. Like that should it should be unacceptable for senior leaders to like spot that sort of behavior and not critique it. Because the thing we need to be doing is starting very small and growing things over time and learning what works. And that then relates back to a transparency point. But like one way of being transparent is working in the open, sharing what's working. So if there is a pilot somewhere, it needs to be very transparent what it's doing, what it's testing, what it's learning over time. So I think I would really like to see the DCIT's guidance and working in the open applied pretty rigorously across the public sector. No excuses for not doing it. And then I think I also saw GDS, maybe I imagine this, I think I saw some kind of service standard or guidance change recently that like AI projects needed to have a user researcher on them, which I think is like part of the answer as well. But it can't be acceptable for like the government to just be, we're going to do an AI project, small thing, national scale, because it's just like it's only in the interest of the companies who are blocking things most of the time.
Yeah. Andy, do you want to comment around the need for transparency and how's that measured? Who measures?
Yeah. I think just there's a few things on transparency. I think transparency for whom is really important in terms of there is sometimes a sense that transparency means some code is open source or some model weightings are open and things like that. If there's a vanishingly small number of people who can actually use that information to understand the performance of something, potentially these are just being performatively transparent. This is going to be about how can people actually understand where they can place their choices. So I think these things like benchmarking are much more helpful in that sense of how does this relate to where I want to place my trust. And then in terms of projects, the use of AI by others, I think it's very much at the moment, broadly speaking, I think the idea of user researchers and being on projects is really good, but that idea of having your ethics processes outlined before you start the work. So how are we going to use AI? What are our guardrails? And we can deliver the project within those rather than deciding halfway through, oh, this is a bit interesting. Where is the line? That just doesn't feel a particularly helpful way of working. So thinking these things through and being really open. And so in the same way that we have kind of open standards around data use and data licenses and these kind of things, I think some sense of, I know where to go on this service, this project, this government entity to tell me how they've used AI in a way that I can understand and engaged with is more important than the kind of performative element of transparency that is trying to give a suggestion of trustworthiness that doesn't actually help anybody.
Great, thank you. One of the questions from the audience is somebody is asking, are local government or central government departments currently using commercial LLMs in public-facing services? And is there evidence it's happening or that it's going to be happening? We've mentioned Anthropic, obviously, earlier. We're working on some career and employment advice. Do any of you have any other examples?
I think there's various projects that are being considered. So I know of some, I'm thinking of examples in the UK, but I know certainly there's examples in other countries, many other countries, all over the world where chatbots are being developed with mixed results. For me, the question really is about where will people get their information from? Because if like Google is a website, right? So going back to it, if people will be using ChatGPT or AI overviews on Google to interact with government, if this is going to become the norm, then something needs to be done to influence that conversation and to think about the types of the requirements in terms of how those answers need to be structured, organized, making sure that they provide the right links, making sure this is the way. In every industry that is using generative AI, we have a set of guidelines or requirements that answers need to comply with. Certainly in heavily regulated industries. Yeah. So when you sell a product to a government, to an organization in one of these sectors, you have very specific things that answers need to comply with. Yeah. So what's the equivalent of that for our right to get accurate public information, not just about government, but let's just say about government services when using these services? I think that's, for me, that's the key thing. And how do we make sure that guidance is developed in the right way, in an inclusive way that takes into account? Because there's lots of opportunities, as I was saying at the beginning. Yeah, so you can do a lot with this technology to tailor answers to various levels of understanding, to different languages. You could use speech. You could so amazing opportunities, but we need to shape how these services are being delivered, and we can. It's not something that is just happening and we're just watching and have no choice or nothing to say.
No agency. Sure. I'm just conscious of time. So what I'm going to do now, before I hand back to Elena to finish up, I'm going to just ask for panelists just to have a quick kind of closing remarks about, public services and AI, and what you think is the most important thing we should all be thinking of right now in relation to integrating AI into public services. What's the key thing? Richard, sorry, Andy.
Yeah, I'll go first on that. I mean, so for me, I think it's building for a change that is happening at the moment. So I am, because of I suppose my background, I'm interested in the plumbing of this kind of stuff, of how do we pass the information that we have to where it is being consumed. We lived in a world where people would come to websites versus the idea that they were going to get snippets, overviews, other things, social media, your content was going to be abstracted and put somewhere else. That is increasingly happening. Elena gave some numbers of how many hundreds of millions of people are using chat assistants and overviews and the like. Our content is going to appear there, and we need to be considering, how do we curate it? How do we look after it? How do we nurture it? How do we kind of make sure that it's wrapped up in such a way that it travels with the context, the caveats, the provenance, the information for it to make sense? And there is some really great work happening there, but it hasn't happened yet. And I think that kind of foundational piece is very much where my head immediately goes to with this.
Great, thanks for that, Andy. Richard?
I perhaps have two. I think one is like that, just starting small and growing things, like that's got to become the norm. At the same time, I think there's like, we need the political and policy classes to really understand the political implications of technology. Maybe all the stuff that happened in the news yesterday, like I'm guessing that's going to spill over into that at some point, reading some headlines. But like we've got to we need much more critical thinking, because it's great that we've got politicians who are excited about digital again, brilliant, but actually needs a bit more critical thought to understand, yes, the opportunity, but also kind of the risks that need mitigating.
Brilliant, thanks.
Okay, so
if you want to make a comment on that, and then you can finish up for.
Yes, no problem. So hard to pick one, but I think for me, as someone who works at the Open Data Institute, so I think we need to just understand again that open approaches to publishing data, designing technology, publishing and licensing software, including AI, remain really, really important. So the UK is talking about making AI. You can, at this day and age, you can make a lot of amazing AI following those principles. And of course, they will not work for every industry and every situation, but we should not forget the role and the advantages and the resilience that this open approaches can deliver. Okay, so back to me then. I have 2 minutes. Well, I think the only thing that is left for me to say is that we will be sharing the slides, and we will also be sharing the Citizen Query UK data sets. There's 3 data sets, by the way, as well as all the other artifacts we have used to test the large language models that I was talking about earlier. If you have any feedback on where we should go with this work going forward, so I think I've mentioned briefly we would want to look at Welsh queries as well as one avenue, but there's many other things that we could do. So we'd love to have your feedback on that. These benchmarks become much better if they are larger, and if you have more queries, and if you test more models in using different types of assessments. So if anyone's interested in working on this with us, by all means, get in touch. So I've mentioned we were working with colleagues from NASA on this. We're open and would welcome collaborations. I'd like to thank Andy and Richard and Emma for the amazing discussions today. Thank you for joining us and sharing your experience and your wisdom and your advice. And I would just say that we will have our next webinar in March, I believe. The date is yet to be confirmed, but will be confirmed shortly. And in March, we will be talking about the National Data Library and the fact that, at least according to us, it can't be rocket science. So with that, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll be in touch via email also with answers to some of the questions we couldn't answer today. Thank you.